In a small, quiet neighborhood, Megan lived with her boyfriend, David, in a modest single-story house. The neighborhood was peaceful, with very little crime, making it a desirable place to live, despite their house being one of the smaller ones on the block. Still, it was a nice home, complete with 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a basement. The street itself was curved in such a way that it provided a sense of privacy. Their house didn't face any neighbors directly, which made it even more appealing. One autumn weekend, David was away in Las Vegas for a bachelor party, leaving Megan home alone from Thursday to Monday. On Friday evening, she had some friends over for a wine night. The evening was fun, filled with laughter and scary movies, until an unexpected interruption occurred. In the middle of a movie, the doorbell rang, sending a shiver through the room. The sound was jarring, especially at that hour. Megan crept over to the window, trying to get a glimpse of who might be outside. There were several cars in the driveway, indicating people were home. But when she peeked through the tiny glass panel above the door, she saw no one standing on the porch. Her friends all agreed it was likely just a late-night prank, so they shrugged it off. They went back to their movie, and eventually called it a night. Hours later, as Megan tried to fall asleep, the doorbell rang again, this time, twice. Her heart raced. It was well after midnight. Glancing at the clock, it was nearly 1 a.m. No one should be at her door at this hour. She immediately called David, who answered sounding tipsy and surrounded by loud noise. After a brief exchange, he told her to stay in the bedroom and not open the door to anyone. His voice was muffled by the bar's noise, but his words were clear. Stay put. Just as Megan was calming down, trying to force herself back to sleep, she heard a strange sound clicking, like something was tapping against the window. Then, a voice broke the silence, calling out from outside. Hey, anyone home? I need some help out here. It was a man's voice, but it didn't sound familiar. Megan's heart skipped a beat. The blinds were shut, and thankfully, she couldn't see who was outside, nor could they see her. But the voice came again. I know you're home, he said. Let me in. Panic surged through Megan. She quickly dialed the police, whispering into the phone as she reported the attempted intrusion. The dispatcher took her details and assured her help was on the way. Megan stayed as quiet as possible, trying not to alert the man that she was inside. Minutes passed, but the man never moved from the window. He continued knocking, his voice growing more insistent. Megan's hands trembled as she clutched the phone. The police arrived soon after, their headlights sweeping across the yard. But when Megan answered the door, she was met with 2 officers. One of them, a tall man, walked right past her without being invited in, stating they were there for the disturbance. Megan explained the situation, but the officer seemed uninterested and even condescending. He asked questions she had already answered, like what the man looked like. But Megan had never seen him. The officer snapped at her. Well, you're the one who called us, ma'am. If you don't want our help, we can leave. Megan was stunned. She had never experienced such an interaction with law enforcement, and it left her feeling more vulnerable than ever. The other officer stood in the background, silent and unhelpful. The tall officer barely took the time to investigate the surroundings, shining his flashlight around the yard, before telling Megan there was nothing they could do unless she had evidence. With that, they left. Though the officers had gone, Megan still couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The night dragged on, and sleep remained out of reach. The terror of the unknown lingered, and the haunting feeling that someone was watching her never quite faded. Jackson was a 20-year-old man working as a pharmacist at a mid-sized hospital in the heart of the mountainous region. His shift was the typical overnight one, 6 p.m. to 4 a.m. Along with his regular duties, he also managed stocking supplies in the surgical rooms. He worked 7 days in a row, followed by 7 days off. The 7 days on were exhausting, but the break felt like a well-earned vacation. One Tuesday night, after working a long shift, Jackson decided to leave a bit early and visit his wife Emma. She had been babysitting her younger cousins at her aunt's house, a place about 30 minutes from their own. Emma had told him that the house felt strange, especially since there were no curtains on the windows. But she insisted there was no need for him to come over. She'd be fine, she said. But after a few restless nights alone in the house, Emma's anxiety got the best of her, and she called Jackson. He didn't hesitate to make the trip. Jackson's shift at the hospital had been draining. The constant flow of tasks meant he had barely a moment to rest. And that night, despite being sleep deprived, he had to power through, as he was expected to be up and active all day. He didn't expect to get much sleep, knowing how his body usually reacted after an exhausting work week. He had already been awake since 2 p.m. the previous day, and as his body cried out for rest, the promise of a busy day ahead kept him alert. The day was packed with errands: dropping the kids off at school, attending a friend's gender reveal party, and picking up groceries for the house. By the time he finished his responsibilities, the exhaustion was setting in. Still, he powered through, relying on a Red Bull to stave off sleepiness. His wife, understanding his fatigue, offered to drive him to work. After all, Jackson's car was out of commission, and neither of them trusted him to drive after more than 24 hours of no sleep. By the time Jackson reached the hospital, he was running on fumes. His shift began like any other. The quiet of the night was often disrupted by the occasional bustle of medical staff or housekeeping. But Jackson was used to it. He had his earbuds in, the music loud enough to help him focus while stocking medication in the surgical rooms. That night, the hospital was busy, with several surgeries finishing up late into the evening. As Jackson worked, he continued to drift in and out of a foggy exhaustion. At one point, he was in the surgery supply room, organizing equipment. The quiet sound of his music was interrupted by a sudden noise. The door behind him creaked, the hinges squealing with the force of someone entering. Jackson immediately turned, half expecting a nurse or surgical staff member, but when he looked up, there was no one there. His first thought was that someone had entered, seen him, and decided to leave. Shrugging it off, Jackson returned to his work. He moved on to another room, opening the door to find the light already off. A strange shadow caught his eye, and his blood ran cold. Someone was hunched over, rummaging through the sharp disposal bin. Jackson froze. The sharp bin was where discarded needles and vials were safely thrown away, an area that had recently been a point of concern after someone was caught trying to steal morphine. That person had been fired, and Jackson had made it a point to always be aware. He turned on the light, intending to confront whoever was in the room. But as the harsh fluorescent lights flickered on, the figure vanished. There was no one there. Confused and shaken, Jackson double-checked the room. There were no signs of anyone leaving in a hurry. The door hadn't been opened or closed in a way that suggested someone had just slipped out unnoticed. He stepped back, the unease creeping over him. He'd spent more than enough time in the hospital's quiet halls to know that late-night shifts had their own weird moments. But something about this didn't sit right with him. As his heart raced, he reminded himself to focus. He couldn't afford to get distracted, not when he was running on so little sleep. He pushed the unsettling thought out of his mind, knowing that he had hours to go before his shift ended. The hospital's quiet buzz continued around him, but Jackson's mind lingered on the strange occurrence. By the time his shift ended, his tired body was ready to collapse. But his mind couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later, when he reunited with Emma after his shift, he tried to explain the incident, but Emma simply shrugged it off. She was glad to see him, but the fatigue on both their faces was evident. The eerie feeling from that night stayed with Jackson for days. Even though he had worked through worse shifts before, this one felt different. As much as Jackson wanted to push it out of his mind, the experience lingered. The unease that had crept into the quiet surgery room seemed to follow him, affecting not just his work, but the restless nights that followed. He couldn't help but wonder, was the hospital haunted by something far darker than late-night exhaustion? Was his mind just playing tricks on him, or had he truly experienced something unexplainable? He didn't know the answer, but the thought stayed with him, haunting the edges of his sleep-deprived mind. In the quiet suburbs of Oakwood, nestled on the outskirts of a bustling Midwestern city, an eerie tale unfolded one fateful night in the spring of 2020. As the world grappled with the onset of a global pandemic, 18-year-old Max found himself drawn to the thrill of urban exploration. Max, a high school senior with a penchant for adventure, had always been fascinated by abandoned places and local legends. Even as his classmates retreated indoors, Max and his friends sought out new experiences in the deserted corners of their town. One crisp evening, Max convinced his new girlfriend, Zoe, to join him on a nocturnal excursion to Whispering Pines Nature Reserve. The park, known for its scenic beauty during the day, took on a sinister air after dark. Local lore spoke of tragic events within its borders, including the unsolved murder of a hiker years prior. As the clock struck 3 a.m., Max and Zoe entered the park, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. The canopy of trees above blocked out most of the moonlight, plunging them into near-total darkness. Max, ever cautious, kept his flashlight off to avoid detection and allow their eyes to adjust to the gloom. 20 minutes into their walk, the couple veered off the main path onto a lesser-known trail. The air grew thick with tension as they ventured deeper into the woods. Suddenly, the stillness of the night was shattered by the haunting melody of a flute. The couple froze, exchanging bewildered glances. The music, eerily beautiful, yet utterly out of place, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As the notes danced through the air, Zoe began to tremble, her fear palpable in the darkness. "Max," she whispered, her voice quivering, "we need to leave. Now." The young man, typically unfazed by such encounters, felt a chill run down his spine. The flute's song grew louder, as if drawing nearer, yet its source remained impossible to pinpoint. With Zoe on the verge of tears, Max made a snap decision. "We're getting out of here," he said, grasping her hand tightly. "Stay close." They began to run, their feet pounding against the earthen path. The flute's melody seemed to chase them, growing ever louder and more frenzied. Suddenly, a loud rustling erupted from the undergrowth beside them. In a heart-stopping moment, something large and unseen dashed across their path. The couple skidded to a halt, their hearts racing. Was it a deer, a bear, or something more sinister? The darkness concealed its true nature, leaving only the sound of snapping twigs and a rush of displaced air in its wake. Panic set in. Max and Zoe turned on their heels, sprinting back the way they came. As they reached the spot where they'd first heard the flute, the music started anew. This time, it was unmistakably close. A lively, almost mocking tune that seemed to surround them completely. Faced with two terrifying options, the unknown creature on the narrow trail or the mysterious flutist on the main path, Max made a split-second choice. "The main trail," he gasped. "It's wider. We can outrun whatever's out there." Hand in hand, they raced down the moonlit path, the otherworldly music fading behind them. Their 7-minute sprint felt like an eternity, each shadow and rustle a potential threat. Finally, they burst out of the woods, gasping for air. Max's truck stood alone in the parking lot, a silent sentinel in the pre-dawn gloom. They scrambled inside, and Max gunned the engine, tires squealing as they fled the park. In the days that followed, Max scoured the internet for similar experiences, but found nothing to explain the ghostly flutist or the unseen creature. His friends listened to the tale with skepticism, but Zoe's corroboration lent credence to his account. To this day, the events of that night remain a mystery. Was it a practical joke, gone too far? A supernatural encounter? Or perhaps something even more inexplicable? Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: Max and Zoe's nocturnal adventure in Whispering Pines had left an indelible mark on their lives. A chilling reminder that sometimes the unknown is best left unexplored. In the heart of Nebraska's sprawling farmlands, where endless fields of wheat stretched as far as the eye could see, stood a solitary farmhouse. This was the home of Ethan Caldwell, a man who had chosen a life of isolation over the bustle of city living. The nearest neighbor was over 2 miles away, and the only sounds that usually punctuated the night were the gentle rustling of crops and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. Ethan had always relished the solitude, finding peace in the vast emptiness that surrounded him. But on this particular night, something felt different. There was an inexplicable tension in the air, a heaviness that seemed to press down on everything. It was close to midnight when Ethan finally finished his work for the day. The old farmhouse creaked and settled round him, the only light coming from a dim lamp in the living room. Despite the late hour and his exhaustion, Ethan felt restless. Sleep eluded him, so he decided to step out onto the porch for a cigarette. The night was unnaturally still. Even the crickets, usually so vocal, seemed subdued. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of the wheat fields. Ethan leaned against the porch railing, fishing a cigarette from his pocket and lighting it. The tip glowed red in the darkness as he took a long drag, feeling the familiar burn in his lungs. As the smoke curled up into the night air, Ethan found his gaze drawn to the dark expanse of the fields. The moon, just a sliver in the sky, cast faint shadows across the landscape. Everything seemed calm, normal even, but as he stood there, a nagging feeling began to grow in the back of his mind. It was a sensation he couldn't quite place, a feeling that he wasn't as alone as he thought. Ethan was about halfway through his cigarette when it happened. He took another long drag, held the smoke in his lungs for a moment, and then exhaled. The smoke drifted out in front of him, swirling in the faint breeze. But instead of dissipating into the night, it seemed to catch on something solid, just a few inches from his face. Blinking in confusion, Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. The smoke curled around an outline, taking shape as it lingered in the air. Slowly, it formed into the unmistakable image of a face. Hollow eyes stared back at him, the mouth slightly open, as if it were about to speak. The details were blurred, as though the face was made of the very smoke Ethan had just exhaled. But it was undeniably there, and it was far too close for comfort. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he stumbled backward, the cigarette slipping from his fingers and falling to the porch. The glowing ember quickly fizzled out as it hit the wood, but Ethan barely noticed. His mind was consumed with one thought: getting away, getting back inside where it was safe. Without thinking, he spun around and rushed for the door, nearly tripping over his own feet in his panic. His hands shook as he fumbled with the handle, finally managing to pull the door open. He threw himself inside, slamming the door shut behind him. The sound echoed through the empty house, but it brought no comfort. Ethan locked the door, his fingers trembling as he turned the deadbolt. For a moment, he just stood there, leaning against the door, trying to catch his breath. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. Was it real, or was it just some trick of the light, a figment of his imagination brought on by exhaustion and isolation? After a few minutes, Ethan forced himself to move. He couldn't just stand there all night. He needed to do something, anything, to make sure he was safe. He went around the house, checking all the windows and doors, making sure they were locked. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. Every creak of the old house made his heart skip a beat. When he was sure the house was secure, Ethan grabbed his phone and called the police. His voice was shaky as he tried to explain what had happened, but the dispatcher didn't ask too many questions. They said they would send someone out to check the area, just to be safe. Ethan wasn't sure what they would find, if anything, but the thought of someone else being out there made him feel a little less alone. It wasn't long before Ethan saw the flash of red and blue lights outside the window. He watched as two officers got out of their patrol car, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They walked around the property, shining their lights into the woods and fields. Ethan couldn't hear what they were saying, but they seemed tense, their movements careful, as if they were expecting something to jump out at them. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers came to the door. Ethan let him in, his hands still shaking. The officer was calm and professional, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that made Ethan's stomach churn. He asked a few questions, took down Ethan's statement, and then radioed his partner. That's when Ethan heard it, the crackle of static, followed by the other officer's voice. He had found someone, a man lurking in the shadows, near the edge of the wheat field. They didn't say much else, just that they were bringing him in. The officer with Ethan nodded, thanked him for calling, and then left to help his partner. Ethan watched as they led the man to the car, his head bowed, his face hidden in the shadows. Ethan couldn't see his expression, couldn't tell what he was thinking. But something was unsettling about the way he moved, as if he had been waiting for this moment. The patrol car drove off into the night, the red and blue lights fading into the darkness. Ethan stood by the window, staring out at the empty road, the fields stretching out endlessly beyond it. He felt no relief, only a lingering unease that he couldn't shake. The man had been arrested, but Ethan had no idea what his intentions were, why he had been there, or why the smoke had formed that face. All Ethan knew was that something had changed that night. Something he couldn't explain, something he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. As he lay in bed later, the house now eerily silent, the memory of that face lingered in his mind. He could still see it, clear as day, hanging in the air just inches from him. And with it came the cold, creeping fear that it wasn't over, that whatever had been out there in the darkness might one day return. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself jumping at every sound, peering out windows at the slightest movement in the fields. The police had assured him that the intruder was in custody, but they couldn't explain the face in the smoke. They chalked it up to stress and an overactive imagination, but Ethan knew what he had seen. He considered moving, leaving the isolation of the farmhouse behind, but something kept him rooted there. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or maybe a deeper need to understand what had happened that night. Whatever the reason, Ethan stayed, but he was changed. He no longer found peace in the solitude. Instead, he felt watched, as if the very fields that had once brought him comfort now harbored some unseen presence. At night, he would sit on the porch, staring out into the darkness, waiting. For what? He wasn't sure. But deep down, Ethan knew that the face in the smoke was more than just a trick of the light. It was a warning, a glimpse into something he couldn't comprehend, and he feared that one day, he would have to face it again. As the wheat swayed in the night breeze, whispering secrets only it knew, Ethan Caldwell sat vigil. A changed man in an unchanged landscape, forever marked by the night. The darkness stared back. In the quiet town of Millbrook, nestled on the outskirts of a bustling city, lived Olivia Chen. She shared a cozy apartment with her roommate, Zoe, in a modest complex overlooking a serene park. On this particular evening, a crisp autumn chill hung in the air, and Olivia found herself alone in their shared space. Zoe had ventured out for a night of revelry with friends, leaving Olivia to bask in the solitude she often craved after long days at the local newspaper office. Yet tonight, an inexplicable unease crept into her bones. As dusk settled, Olivia curled up on their well-worn sofa, wrapping herself in a soft blanket. The television flickered, casting dancing shadows across the dimly lit living room. Every so often, she glanced at her phone, hoping for a message from Zoe, but the screen remained stubbornly dark. Hours ticked by, and the world outside seemed to fade away. The usual symphony of car engines and rustling leaves gave way to an unsettling silence. Olivia's attempts to focus on the TV program proved futile as her mind wandered, conjuring up scenarios that sent shivers down her spine. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant footstep echoing through the night, set her nerves on edge. Despite her rational mind insisting otherwise, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone in the apartment. Suddenly, a sound pierced the silence, a faint scratching at the front door. Olivia's body tensed, her heart pounding against her ribcage. The scratching persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. Frozen in fear, Olivia's mind raced through possible courses of action. Should she call for help? Make a run for it? Before she could decide, the door burst open with a thunderous crash that shattered the night's stillness. A scream caught in Olivia's throat as a towering figure appeared in the doorway. Silhouetted against the darkness, the intruder's features were obscured, but his imposing presence filled the room. For a moment, time stood still as they faced each other in a silent standoff. Adrenaline surged through Olivia's veins, propelling her towards the kitchen. Her fingers closed around the handle of a knife, the cold metal offering a small measure of comfort. The intruder's heavy footsteps echoed through the apartment, each step measured and deliberate. Crouched behind the kitchen counter, Olivia struggled to control her ragged breathing. The knife felt alien in her trembling hands, but she gripped it tightly, prepared to defend herself if necessary. The footsteps drew nearer, then abruptly ceased. The ensuing silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic beating of Olivia's heart. Had he left? Was he still lurking in the shadows? A loud crash from the living room shattered her hopes. Seizing the moment, Olivia dashed towards her bedroom, knife still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. She slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock, as panic threatened to overwhelm her. Outside, she could hear the intruder ransacking the apartment. With shaking hands, Olivia retrieved her phone from the nightstand and dialed emergency services. The operator's calm voice provided a lifeline amidst the chaos, assuring her that help was on the way. As sirens wailed in the distance, an eerie quiet descended upon the apartment. Olivia held her breath, straining to hear any movement beyond the bedroom door. The silence stretched on, broken only by a sharp knock and a voice announcing the arrival of the police. Relief washed over Olivia as she opened the door to find two officers standing before her. They quickly swept the apartment, but the intruder had vanished without a trace. The only evidence of the terrifying ordeal was the splintered front door, its lock hanging uselessly. The remainder of the night passed in a blur of police statements and crime scene investigations. Olivia found herself unable to return to the apartment, the memory of the shadowy figure still fresh in her mind. In the days that followed, Olivia struggled to shake off the lingering effects of that harrowing night. The image of the intruder standing in the doorway haunted her dreams, and every unexpected sound sent her heart racing. The sense of violation lingered, tainting the once comforting spaces of her home. As time passed, Olivia and Zoe implemented new security measures in their apartment, but the scars of that night ran deep. Olivia found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, jumping at shadows, and double-checking locks. The incident had shattered her sense of safety, leaving behind a persistent anxiety that colored her daily life. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, Olivia slowly began to reclaim her life. She found strength in sharing her story, connecting with others who had experienced similar traumas. Through therapy and the unwavering support of Zoe and her friends, Olivia gradually rebuilt her sense of security. While the memory of that night would never fully fade, Olivia refused to let it define her. She channeled her experience into her work, writing powerful pieces about personal safety and community vigilance. Her ordeal had changed her, but it had also revealed a resilience she never knew she possessed. As autumn gave way to winter, and then to spring, Olivia found herself looking forward rather than constantly glancing back. The apartment that had once felt like a trap now became a symbol of her perseverance. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to grow stronger. In the end, Olivia's story became one not just of fear and violation, but of courage and recovery. She had faced her darkest night and emerged, changed but unbroken, ready to embrace whatever life had in store for her next.
Thanks for joining us in the shadows tonight. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories every week. Have you got a story of your own? Share it in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And remember, the darkness holds many secrets. Are you brave enough to uncover them? Until next time, keep your lights on and your doors locked. Sweet nightmares.